I mean, the New Deal, I think we have a sense of the Reformation that happens there, but let's move to what you call the post-war hinge. What is that about?
Yeah, so there's a whole family of different explanations about what the New Deal was, how radical it was, how conservative it was. Some at the time saw the New Deal as being socialist or communist. I think that's not the case. Others have seen the New Deal as being conservative in its attempts to kind of restore capitalism, put it back together. A long history here. We probably shouldn't get too much into the weeds, but my argument is that actually we don't really know what the New Deal was about until after World War II. In part because World War II involved, huge public investment programs, huge public interventions into the economy to win the war, which kind of scrambled the politics of the 1930s, or put many of the politics of the 1930s up for grabs in the context of the war. And so you have to get out of the war before you can really see what the New Deal is about. And I argue that the New Deal was about a few things. First, it's about regulating finance. It's about constraining the role and power of finance in the economy. Second, it's what I call politics of income. So it's going to leave investment in private hands, corporate hands, because this is an era dominated by large corporations like General Motors, Ford, et cetera. And it's going to redistribute income after investment and after production have occurred through collective bargaining. We've been talking about that, through the welfare state. We mentioned Social Security, and also through philanthropy, which I think is a kind of unappreciated dimension of the New Deal political order. So that's what it's about: regulating finance in the interest of trying to move investment into production, but leaving investment in private hands and then redistributing income after it's taken place. The third thing, I'd mentioned why the post-war period is really important, is the rise of the Cold War. And so ideologically, the Cold War sets a very hard left edge on just how far to the left the New Deal can go. I mean, you mentioned Taft-Hartley, which was labor law passed after the war that diminished the Wagner Act, the Wagner Act of 1935, which first legitimated collective bargaining. So I think after the war, we see the New Deal shift a little bit to the right, and that really establishes what the New Deal order is going to look like in the post-war decades.
Can you just explain? You mentioned the middle aspect of the distribution of income after investment. What would have been an alternative to that?
Right. So we talked about this a little bit, with those 19th century labor visions. I think the alternative is politicizing capital, right? Who owns capital, on what terms, where, right? Politics decides investment should go. What should society invest in collectively, given our collective priorities as a public, right? As a democratic polity. So that's the alternative. And you don't have that in the New Deal. It's its fundamental weakness. And I think, the word nostalgia came up earlier. I think it's, the New Deal did many, many things. We talked about, labor law. We could talk about an era of equality, income equality relative to what we have now. So many things that were better now than then. But to be nostalgic for the New Deal, I think is very misplaced. It had some real flaws. And this issue of investment, where we started talking about we were talking about definitions of capitalism, it's weak there. It doesn't have robust programs of public investment, and it leaves investment in private hands. And so that's going to lead to problems, which is why the New Deal order breaks up.
Okay, so I mean, just to be a little bit more tangible, so that people understand, like that could have been, instead of like having private railroads, you have the public own the railroad. Instead of having, power generated privately, you could have the public generate the.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you pressed, because that issue, shows how the Cold War just muddied everything, right? Because the rhetoric, the politics is, well, we have to have a kind of Soviet command and control economy, or free enterprise over here, right? So investment is in private hands, or the state has to own everything. But no, there's all kinds of things you can do in the middle. So you can have mixed public-private kinds of partnerships. You can have the state be involved at the regional or local level in providing access to capital and credit for private parties who don't have access to it through the normal banking system, which is dominated in Wall Street or controlled by, corporations, to go back to the monopoly issue.
You could have public banks. You could have
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You could have, the New Deal, that's at one point during the war proposed regional investment trusts that would try to, make capital accessible to parts of the country that didn't have access to capital, or to people, speaking of white male breadwinners, who didn't have access to capital. So I think there is a role for public ownership in many respects. I mean, you talked about power generation. I mean, I wouldn't say that's always wrong, but there's lots of different policies one could imagine, and people have imagined, that would politicize capital and politicize capital ownership and investment, instead of saying, okay, we're going to let, the economy run on private investment, and then we're going to try to fix everything after production has taken place, right, post-hoc, by redistributing income, which is something we should also do, don't get me wrong, but has its limits, right, has its own limits.
Right. The analog to that argument was, after the repeal of Glass-Steagall under the Clinton administration, it comes back up in 2000 in the wake of the financial crisis. Do we just not allow this type of behavior to exist, or do we allow it to exist and try and fine tune it so that it doesn't become the potential catastrophe that it was, I guess, 10, 12 years ago? And it's that type of, I guess, mentality. We can fix it after the fact.
That's exactly right.